there would be no strikes, and that employment, wages, and production levels would be maintained even if it meant taking a loss. So he would have companies come in. They had to pledge that they would not lay off people. They had to pledge that if they made reductions in their production line, it would be minimal. And they had to pledge that they would not cut wages except through negotiation with the workers. He was particularly concerned about unemployment and wages, because if incomes are shrinking amongst the working classes, you're going to have much less money going into the economy for basics. He could accept the loss of stock value because that was in principle extra income, and that the people who lived on stock still had enough assets to continue surviving. So that what the first thing you had to do was sort of maintain daily consumption, levels of daily consumption, and maintain employment levels. Now, everybody came in and everybody pledged that they were good Americans and they would be patriotic and they would not lay off people and they would not lower wages. But in fact, they couldn't live up to these promises. They had to face a situation where consumption was shrinking because of high degrees of uncertainty, because of the financial crisis, because of the banking crisis, because world trade had stopped. They had the value of their money was decreasing. So how are they going to maintain wages if the value of money is decreasing? You would be, in effect, giving everybody a raise if you didn't cut their wages. So they began initially, I'm talking about the large companies, by reducing wages for both salaried and hourly employees. But then they were forced into position, because no product was moving, of having salary obligations that surpassed their income. The only way they could meet those salary obligations then was to go into their capital assets. So if we go back to this Diego Rivera painting, what it's talking about is the companies and the banks have money, but they've decided they can't spend it. It would be foolish to spend it. So it's kept in the vault while people are thrown out of work. Now, everybody regretted this. Nobody thought it was a good thing to do. They understood that from the larger scope of the economy, this was a bad thing to do, but they also had a responsibility to try to keep their company solvent. And this is where Hoover's strategy faced its first real impediment, was that appeals to social good wouldn't work in situations where everybody began to feel that their decisions had life or death consequences. So they naturally chose life, to prolong the health of their company as long as they could, even if it meant it had negative consequences for the total economy. So that aspect of a strategy, it had good feelings at the beginning and probably, you could say, worked for 6 months, collapsed by the beginning of 1931. The other thing that he did was to assemble mayors and governors from around the country and to get them to to speed up public works projects. Now, he had two reasons for this. One was public works would put people together, put people to work, and provide another set of money entering into the economy and allow basic everyday living standards to be maintained. But the other reason, which was equally important, was that as Secretary of Commerce, he knew the dire straits in which the U.S. infrastructure had fallen. And thus the country absolutely needed to renew its infrastructure. So public works would actually address some of the basic problems underlying the Depression, so that the United States would emerge from the Depression stronger. And in order to help them, he lobbied Congress to provide money to state and local governments to help pay part of the costs. This strategy, at least to some degree, worked in 1930, but in the November 1930 election, the Democrats won control of both houses of Congress, and they came in on the principle that this kind of public works spending was irresponsible in a time, in difficult economic times, and was simply government intrusion into the market, and therefore no further spending was forthcoming from 1931 and 1932. Now this is ironic because we think of the New Deal as a program that involved massive public works, and it did. But Hoover had actually tried to begin the public works spending. And if you remember, Calvin Coolidge said in that little film clip, the federal government's responsible for 10% of all government spending. At the end of the New Deal, the federal government was responsible for 14% of all federal spending, of all government spending. 14%. So that's a 40% increase from Calvin Coolidge. But when Hoover was president, it had already risen to 12%. So Hoover began deficit spending in order to address the problems of the recession. And Roosevelt expanded the level of spending. But the other major difference was that Hoover did not want the federal government to actually do the projects. He wanted the state and local governments to do the project, whereas the New Deal had the federal government take over many of the projects itself. Third leg of Hoover's approach to ending the Depression was submitting a drastic tax cut bill to Congress, which he did in December 1929. And taxes were reduced by more than 50% on the assumption that this would stimulate spending. And to help finance it, federal employees took a 15% pay cut. But as it turned out, the tax cut had no impact on spending because people were afraid to spend. If they had more money, they hoarded it because of the uncertainty. And then the Democrats came in 1931, and they reversed the tax cuts because they were opposed to deficit spending. And indeed, when Roosevelt ran against Hoover in 1932, he ran on economic terms to the right of Hoover, accusing him of being a spendthrift and driving up deficits. Also another irony. The only result to Hoover's first efforts to address the Depression was this apparent bottoming out of stock market prices. But then in 1930, that is, it appeared that in fact, for most of 1930 that things were not going to get worse and they might get a little bit better. But then at the end of 1930 and then through in early 1931, stock market prices dropped again, largely responding to the shutting down of Europe-US trade. Essentially, and then after 31, Hoover found it increasingly difficult to adopt any policies because he was dealing with a Democratic Party-controlled Congress, and the two were simply fighting each other. We had a period of what we now call gridlock in 31 and 32, where there were essentially no policies being implemented, while the economy was continuing to worsen and worsen and worsen. Hoover felt that he was being sabotaged by the Democrats, who were sacrificing the well-being of the country for narrow political purposes. At least that's when he left office. He was absolutely convinced that the Democratic Party had never had any intention of solving the problems. They wanted to profit from the Depression, and they used it to gain a political power that they otherwise would not have gained. So, factors, we'll have to continue this on Monday, but factors that caused the Great Depression, some of which I've been alluding to already. Economic historians who've studied the factors in the Great Depression have come up with four major factors. The first is the question of overproduction. The United States economy could produce more goods than it could consume. The second was excessive debt loads. The third were irresponsible fiscal and monetary policies. And the fourth were irresponsible international trade policies. And then the fifth, which was the question of inadequate and aging systems in most parts of the economy. Yes. The third one is irresponsible fiscal and monetary policies. Now, the major historian of the causes of the Great Depression is Ben Bernanke, who's now head of the Federal Reserve Board. And so presumably, having been the leading scholar on the causes of the Great Depression, he applied some of those lessons to the